A small industrial town along the southern edge of Ontario, there's a machine shop that has been operating for over 30 years. Concrete floors, steel racks, oil-stained workbenches, nothing unusual. Every late spring, the same pattern appears. Ants begin emerging through hairline cracks in the floor, forming organized trails toward sugar residues, spiven condensation forming under metal equipment. Within days, the entire workspace becomes mapped by moving lines. Most shops in the area handle it the same way. They call a service. A technician arrives, sprays the perimeter, visible entry points, and schedules a follow-up visit. The activity drops for a short time, then returns weeks later. The cycle repeats. But in this particular shop, the owner does something different. He takes a small container, mixes a white powder with ordinary sugar, adds a small amount of warm water, places it directly along the ant trail using pieces of scrap cardboard. No protective gear, no specialized equipment, no branded product. Within hours, the number of ants increases dramatically. The trail becomes thicker, more active, more organized. By the next day, the movement begins to slow. By the second day, the entire system is gone. Not reduced, not controlled. Gone. No second application, no perimeter treatment, no recurring service. What's happening here is not a surface-level kill. It is a system-level failure triggered from inside the colony itself. And this is not a new method. It has been documented, studied, and used in domestic environments for over a century. It is still registered for pest control use, still sold in standard retail stores, and still costs less than a single cup of coffee per application. Which raises a simple question. If a method like this exists, is widely available, and consistently effective, why do most people never use it? To answer that, you have to go deeper than the mixture itself. You have to understand the structure it's designed to break. Before modern pest control existed as a service, mineral-based compounds were already moving through trade routes, households, and agricultural systems as practical tools. Across regions that never communicated with each other, the same pattern appears in parts of Central Asia. Borate-rich minerals were collected from dry lake beds and transported along caravan routes, not as a specialized chemical, but as a multi-use material. It was used in cleaning, preservation, and in controlled storage environments where insects posed a constant threat to grain reserves. In rural Anatolia and Eastern Europe, compounds were mixed with sweet carriers and placed near storage pits and wooden structures. The goal was not to repel insects. It was to let them carry the substance back into their own networks. In North Africa, records from early agricultural settlements describe mineral salts being applied around food storage areas, not as barriers but as ingestion points. The logic was consistent. When insects feed and redistribute, the system itself becomes the delivery mechanism. These were not coordinated discoveries. Independent solutions arriving at the same conclusion. And that matters, because when multiple civilizations, separated by geography, language, and time, arrive at the same operational method, it usually means the method is aligned with something fundamental, not cultural preference, but biological structure. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this approach had already transitioned into everyday domestic use across North America. Kept small quantities of borate-based powder alongside laundry supplies and general cleaners. It was not marketed as a specialized pesticide. It was simply another functional material, cheap, stable, and widely available. Application required no instructions beyond basic ratios. A spoon, a bowl, a small amount of sugar, and placement near activity zones. That was enough. Over time, the method became routine, not because it was promoted, but because it worked consistently enough to be passed down without formal documentation. Then something changed. Not in the chemistry, not in the insects, not in the availability of the material. Changed was how problems like this began to be framed and who was expected to solve them. To understand that shift, to look at the mechanism itself. Because once you see how it actually works, the rest of the system becomes easier to explain. At a surface level, most people assume insect control is about toxicity, apply something strong enough, and the insect dies. But that model breaks down quickly when you read dealing with social insects like ants. Ant colony is not a loose collection of individuals. It operates as a distributed system. Workers and the queen are connected through continuous resource exchange. Food is not consumed independently. It is processed, shared, and redistributed across the entire structure. This is where the mechanism changes. When a worker ant encounters the mixture, it does not detect it as a threat. The sugar component signals a high-value food source. The mineral component is ingested without immediate disruption. There is no instant kill, no behavioral alarm. That delay is not a flaw. It is the core of the system. Over the next several hours, the compound begins interfering with the ant's internal regulation, primarily digestion and fluid balance at the cellular level. The worker remains functional long enough to complete its primary role, transport. It returns to the nest. Once inside, the material enters the colony's distribution network through trophallaxis, the continuous mouth-to-mouth exchange of liquid nutrients. This is not occasional behavior, it is constant. It is how the colony maintains cohesion, shares energy, and synchronizes activity. Every transfer spreads the compound further. Workers feed other workers. Feed larvae. Workers feed the queen. At no point does the system recognize a single point of failure, because there isn't one. The compound is not attacking from the outside. It is being integrated into the colony's own supply chain. This is why surface treatments struggle to produce lasting results. A spray kills exposed workers, interrupts visible activity, but it does not reach the queen or the brood chambers located deeper within the structure. The colony compensates. Production continues. The system rebuilds. In contrast, ingestion-based compound leverages the colony's strongest adaptation, resource sharing, and converts it into a distribution pathway. As more workers discover the bait, pheromone trails intensify. Recruitment increases. What looks like a surge in activity is actually the system scaling its own intake. More ants arrive. More material is transported. More of the colony becomes exposed. Over a 24 to 48-hour period, the internal balance begins to collapse. Queen's intake is disrupted. Egg production declines. Larvae fail to develop properly. Worker coordination weakens as chemical signaling becomes inconsistent. The system does not explode. It degrades, and once that degradation reaches the reproductive core, recovery becomes unlikely. This is not a fast kill. It is a structural failure, and that distinction determines whether the problem returns or ends. To understand why this method feels different in practice, you have to compare it directly with how most people are taught to deal with ants. The default approach is visual suppression. You see movement, you remove it. Sprays, wipes, powders applied at entry points. The goal is immediate reduction. And in the short term, it works. Within minutes of applying a contact pesticide, visible ants die. The trail disappears. The area looks clean again. From a user perspective, the problem appears solved. Beneath that surface, the structure remains intact. The queen is still active. The brood chambers are untouched. The colony continues producing workers. What UV removed is the outer layer, the foraging units, not the system that generates them. So within days or weeks, the same pattern reappears, new trails, same cycle. This is why repeated treatments become normalized, not because the problem is unusually complex, because the intervention is targeting the wrong layer. Now compare that to an ingestion-based approach. When the mixture is placed correctly, the first visible effect is not reduction, it's amplification. More ants appear, trails become thicker, activity increases. This is the point where most people assume failure. A system perspective, this is the exact outcome you want. The colony is not resisting the treatment. It is accelerating its own exposure. Workers are reinforcing pheromone trails, recruiting additional foragers, and increasing the rate at which material is transported back into the nest. What looks like escalation is actually saturation. Over the next 24 hours, you begin to see a shift. The trails lose definition. Movement becomes inconsistent. Recruitment drops. By 48 hours, the structure is no longer functioning as a coordinated system. There is no need for a second wave of treatment because there is no longer a stable colony to sustain activity. This is the fundamental difference in performance. One method removes what is visible and requires repetition. The other disrupts what is invisible and resolves the system itself. And once you understand that distinction, the remaining question is no longer about effectiveness. It becomes about why one approach dominates behavior while the other remains underused. Once you compare the two approaches side by side, the economic structure around them becomes clearer. Pest control, in its current form, is not built around single event resolution, built around ongoing service. Most providers operate on scheduled cycles, monthly, quarterly, or seasonal, because insect activity is recurring and predictable. From a business perspective, that model is stable. Planning, staffing, and consistent revenue across large customer bases. But also shapes how solutions are packaged and delivered. Methods that require repeated application align naturally with this structure. They're easy to standardize, easy to deploy across different environments, and easy to integrate into routine visits. The aim is not necessarily permanent elimination, but controlled activity over time. In contrast, cost ingestion method behaves differently. It is not proprietary. It does not require specialized equipment. It does not create a schedule. When it works as intended, it reduces the need for immediate follow-up. That makes it harder to integrate into a recurring service framework, even though the mechanism itself is well understood and documented. At the same time, retail markets have evolved toward branded solutions. For package baits, gels, And liquid stations are designed for convenience and consistency. They often use similar underlying principles, present them in controlled formats with clear instructions and measured dosing. Over time, this shifts perception. People begin to associate effectiveness with packaging, branding, and professional application rather than with the underlying mechanism. Simpler methods, even when technically sound, become less visible because they are not positioned within those systems. It is not the disappearance of the method, but a change in how often it is chosen. It remains available. It remains functional, but it no longer sits at the center of decision-making. And that shift is driven less by chemistry and more by how solutions are structured, delivered, and maintained over time. For all its efficiency, this method is not universal, and it does not produce identical outcomes in every environment. Its performance depends on alignment with behavior. Different ant species shift their feeding preferences throughout the year. Periods of colony growth, protein sources may be prioritized over sugars. In those cases, a sugar-based mixture will attract fewer workers, reducing intake and slowing distribution. The mechanism still functions, the entry point is weaker. Placement is equally critical. If the mixture is positioned away from active trails, it may never enter the colony's transport network. Ants do not randomly search every surface. They follow established paths, guided by pheromone signals. Missing those paths means the system is never engaged. Environmental conditions also influence stability. Excess humidity can dilute the mixture and reduce its concentration. Dry, high-temperature conditions can cause it to harden or crystallize, making it less attractive as a liquid food source. In both cases, the delivery medium becomes less effective, even though the active component remains unchanged. Colony structure introduces another layer. Large infestations often consist of multiple nests operating in parallel. These satellite colonies may not share resources continuously. Treating one pathway can collapse one segment while leaving others intact. This creates the impression of partial success unless multiple entry points are addressed. Timing is the final constraint. The mechanism relies on delayed transfer. Interruption during the early phase can prevent full distribution. Killing foraging ants, removing bait too early. Introducing competing treatments can break the chain before it reaches the queen and brood. From a safety standpoint, the compound is classified as low toxicity, but it is not inert. It should be handled with basic precautions, kept out of reach of children and animals, and applied in controlled locations where only insects can access it. None of these limitations invalidate the method. They define the conditions under which it performs reliably. And understanding those conditions is what separates a one-time result from inconsistent repetition. Even when the method is applied correctly, most people abandon it too early. Not because it fails, but because it behaves differently than expected. The expectation is immediate control. When ants appear, the instinct is to remove them as quickly as possible. Sprays, wipes, and physical removal provide instant feedback. The visible threat disappears, and that reinforces the idea that speed equals effectiveness. The ingestion method reverses that sequence. Placement activity increases. More ants arrive. The trail becomes more defined. From a psychological standpoint, this feels like escalation. It looks like the problem is getting worse, not better. Without understanding the mechanism, the natural reaction is to intervene, clean the area, remove the bait, or apply a contact pesticide. That interruption breaks the system at its most critical phase. Is actually happening during that increase in activity is not expansion, it is concentration. The colony is redirecting its workforce toward a single resource. Recruitment is intensifying. Transport volume is rising. The delivery network is operating at maximum capacity. This is the exact moment where the method is most effective, but is also the moment where it is most likely to be stopped. There is also a perception gap. Professionally packaged products and services signal reliability. They come with instructions, branding, and visible authority. A simple mixture prepared at home does not carry the same weight, even if the underlying mechanism is identical or even more direct. Over time, this shifts trust away from simple systems towards structured solutions, regardless of actual performance. Another factor is generational knowledge loss. Methods that were once passed down through routine use are no longer demonstrated. Without exposure, they feel unfamiliar, and unfamiliar methods are often perceived as less reliable, even when they are well documented. The result is a mismatch between how the method works and how people expect it to work. Closing that gap is not about changing the method. It's about understanding the phase where it looks like failure, and recognizing that it is actually the point where success is already in motion. Once you understand how the mechanism actually operates, the problem stops looking like a series of random intrusions and starts looking like a mapped system. The ants you see are not the problem, they are indicators. Each trail represents a supply route. Each entry point represents a connection between the external environment and an internal structure you cannot see. The visible activity is simply the outer layer of a much larger network operating with consistency and purpose. This changes how intervention is designed. Instead of reacting to scattered movement, you begin identifying patterns. Where do trails converge? Where is traffic most consistent? Where are workers slowing down, turning, or clustering? These are not just observations, they are access points into the system's flow. Placement becomes strategic. You are no longer trying to cover an area. You are inserting a material directly into the colony's transport pathway. The goal is not exposure at the surface, but distribution at the core. This also changes how results are evaluated. Immediate disappearance is no longer the primary signal. Instead, you look for structural changes. Trails lose cohesion, recruitment weakens, movement becomes fragmented. These are signs that the internal network is degrading. The system is longer able to coordinate its own behavior. Once that coordination breaks, recovery becomes difficult. Not because every individual has been removed, but because the structure that organizes them has been compromised. Over time, this way of thinking extends beyond a single application. It creates a framework. Identify the system. Understand its dependencies. Introduce minimal input at the point of maximum leverage. This is not just a pest control method. Shift from reacting to symptoms to influencing systems. And once that shift is made, the same logic can be applied to any recurring problem that appears complex on the surface, but is actually structured underneath. The end of this, the material itself, is not the most important part. What matters is understanding why it works. A simple compound available in any store can outperform more complex solutions when it is aligned with the structure of the problem. Not because it is stronger, but because it is positioned correctly within the system. That changes what control looks like. Control is no longer about constant intervention, repeated treatment, or escalating intensity. It becomes about timing, placement, and understanding flow. When the pattern appears again, the response is not reactive. It is deliberate. You recognize the trail. You identify the entry point. You introduce the material at the right location. And then you allow the system to carry the process forward on its own. This does not replace every tool, and it does not apply to every situation. But in cases where the mechanism is clear and the structure is predictable, it offers something different. A solution that does not depend on repetition. A method that does not scale in cost. And a level of autonomy that comes from understanding, not outsourcing. If this way of thinking is useful, because once you start looking for systems instead of symptoms, you begin to see how many problems are structured the same way, and how often the simplest entry point is the one that changes everything.